Hello A-level students, and welcome to the first in what will be a series of lessons on the Handmaid's Tale. These lessons are aimed at AQA students studying the English language and literature A-level, but they could also be very useful to you if you're studying the Handmaid's Tale for any course, or if you're just casually interested in analysis of this exceptional text. In this lesson we will be looking at the context, and I will try and give you as clear a possible overview of these elements. First of all, we'll have a quick look at the AQA Imagined Worlds questions, so we know what we're up against. We'll consider the value of wider reading and how to go about that. We'll look at the genre context of dystopias, broader literary contexts. We'll think about some of the specific political and social factors that influenced the Handmaids, and we'll think about Atwood's own attitude on the Handmaids. Before we begin, it's worth pointing out that these lessons are not going to give you character summaries, plot summaries, or theme summaries. These lessons presuppose that you have already read the text and have a strong or at least a reasonable understanding of those things, and you'll need that understanding in order to access what's in these lessons. So first things first, if you don't know the text, you do need to go away and read it and enjoy it. Secondly, you also perhaps need to look at collecting your knowledge of the text so that you have a kind of an exam level understanding of plot and character and so on and so forth. What these lessons will do is look at providing you with deeper analytical perspectives, perhaps with some ideas about what's really distinctive about this novel, about the narrative, about the language used, so that you're well equipped to shine in an examination. Okay, so let's begin with that AQA question. If you've done GCSE, you'll be familiar with the part to whole question, and the AQA language and literature question in the Imagined Worlds section is basically a part to whole. You'll be presented an extract, and then you'll be asked to explore the significance of character or theme in the section and the novel as a whole. And that word significance will be key, and when we get to our final lesson, we'll look at perhaps exploring what significance means and how that helps us prioritise the material that we use in a question. But there's interesting bullet points beneath the question, one of which prompts you to explore the use of fantasy elements in constructing a fictional world. And this is a bullet point which is leading you towards an evaluation of genre and an evaluation of literary context. And context is more heavily weighted in this question than the other two aspects that the examiner is marking, which are linguistic analysis and knowledge of the text. You'll notice that, the 15 marks available out of 35 for your evaluation of context and genre. So in order to succeed at this question, you really need to show an awareness of how The Handmaid's Tale belongs to a literary context. And we have to think broadly about context. We have to think about literary factors, political and critical factors that have influenced the text. It's not just about knowing facts about when the text was written or facts about Atwood. It's about understanding how this piece of work fits in a broader literary context. And because of that, you are going to need to be prepared to read widely. And the cost of success on this course, and on any English course really, is wide reading. I know it can seem like a chore sometimes when you have a long reading list. However, if you don't like reading, well, I don't know. Someone might say, why are you studying English? Because there's no way around it. To be successful on an English course, you've got to be prepared to read widely and to summarise the things that you've read. You're also going to have to read beyond the core text, so reading The Handmaids is an obvious requirement. I'm sure there are people who got away at GCSE without actually reading their core texts in full. That would be madness to attempt the same approach to A-level. Read the core text, but also you would really benefit from reading other novels from the dystopian tradition, and you'll get some suggestions from this PowerPoint. It's indispensable really for you to look at literary criticism, so evaluations and analyses of the text written from a literary standpoint. But also, this is a live text and a contemporarily very relevant text. So what's out there in the media, what articles, interviews, reviews and biographies are out there that can give us different perspectives on this text. In these lessons, I'll try and pinpoint opportunities for you to read widely, but your own research really should underpin the whole, and your own ability to read widely should feature in every aspect of this course. A few recommended sources, just a couple there. The EMC English and Media Centre EMAG is a tailored resource which produces literary criticism for A-level students based on A-level texts. There are frequently articles in there, or literary criticism in there, on the Handmaids. Your school may have a subscription and it may have copies in the library. If it doesn't, you should certainly pressure your teachers to get a subscription, which also enables you to have electronic access to the back issues. These are really indispensable. The perspectives and the criticism offered in the EMAG is really indispensable. And I find it very valuable. But also contemporary media sources like The Guardian. Atwood, as we shall see, is very fond of giving interviews to The Guardian and occasionally writing articles for them as well. So read widely. Let's begin then our look at the actual context by asking the question, what are dystopias? And a dictionary definition suggests an imaginary place or condition in which everything is as bad as possible. And maybe after reading Handmaids, and maybe after this lesson, we could possibly evaluate that description and ask whether that accurately defines dystopia. We'll also look at some of Atwood's own ideas of what constitutes a dystopia, and I'm not sure that she would be happy necessarily with that definition for Handmaids. But it's useful to look perhaps at the contrast between utopia and dystopia, and the fact that the word is formed from this root, utopia meaning the perfect society, and interestingly that's the original word is utopia, and then some politician in the 19th century added this negating prefix dys, which we know from dysfunctional, to suggest the opposite of an ideal or perfect society, the worst possible society. Dystopias as texts present readers with possible versions of our own society, and they do that by anticipating social change in a fearful or negative way. And I've tried to encapsulate that with the picture there, a sort of characteristically dystopian image, and this hypothetical proposition, wouldn't it be terrible if? Wouldn't it be a disaster if? And I guess dystopias are hypothetical in nature. They are supposed imagined scenarios which I suppose present us with the worst case or a greatly to be feared scenario in a way that enables us to evaluate our own society. So let's have a quick think about the literary context and the literary history of dystopias. Thomas More, there you can see in the first picture, he was a famous philosopher and theologian. He was a very powerful religious figure in the life of Henry VIII, and he wrote a book which tried to envisage a perfect society. He saw this as a kind of an ideological exploration in thinking about how we could make life perfect for everyone. Later we'll see that Atwood considers this a rather dangerous thing to do. More was later beheaded by Henry VIII. He didn't support Henry VIII's religious reforms or his marriage, and he had his head chopped off. So much for all of that imagining a perfect society. But following on from Thomas More in the literary history of English, we get satirical novels and satires. And satires, as you may know, offer a version of society that is in some way grotesque, in some way deformed or exaggerated in order to make a point. And there is a relationship between dystopia and satire. Gulliver's Travels there, if you don't know the story, a traveller finds himself in strange lands, one in which he is tiny and surrounded by giants. In another strange land he travels to, he is a giant and surrounded by tiny people. But the societies that he visits are satirical mirrors of the society that Swift was writing in. And in a sense, these are kind of heightened the corruptions within these societies are presented in a heightened manner. So these offer us a kind of a prototypical form of dystopia. But when dystopian literature really begins to thrive is the 20th century, so those are the years beginning 1900. And the reason that dystopias, I suppose, in literature thrive is because politics and history provides them with so many opportunities to survive. If you know a little bit about the history of the 20th century, as I hope you do, you'll know that there were multiple brutal tyrannies, the Nazis and Soviet Russia. There were great outrages committed, such as the Holocaust. These are, I guess, I suppose these are examples of almost, reality, dystopias in reality. This made in the 20th century dystopia a prominent genre. It was bad news, of course, for humanity, but great news for people like George Orwell. Orwell, after the Second World War, Orwell wrote his novel 1984, which looked at a tyrannical surveillance society, and in many ways is seen to have predicted social and technological change in the 20th century. It's considered to be a prophetic piece of work. 1984 is the paradigm, the key dystopia. In many ways it's considered the central, the finest example. It's certainly not without its flaws. If you were to read one dystopian novel, 1984 is a text that you should read, and that really applies to you whether you're a literature student. Any intelligent thinking adult really should seek to read 1984. Because it's one of the finest pieces of work ever written, and it will give you perhaps a troubled understanding of the society in which you live. Following on from Orwell, dystopian ideas have become generally highly influential. Offshoots such as disaster movies. I would stop at calling them dystopian, but they're certainly derived from dystopia. We have tropes such as the zombie apocalypse. I don't know, maybe even Sharknado. These are, I guess, essentially dystopian in their concepts because they present the worst possible case of a society or a disastrous events that we are supposed to imagine could happen to us in the future. So dystopia has been highly influential, and it isn't just literature, it's film, it's art, it's music. And the themes of these dystopias have adapted as the 20th century has developed. As our political and social fears have developed, dystopias have developed with them. As a sideline, it's worth thinking about what we call, or what is known as, the Western canon, or the canon in literature. The canon is the collection of works that are said to be definitive. These are the finest works of English literature. They are the most influential. And one way of evaluating literature is to take any given text and analyse it in relation to what might be seen as canonical works, these central works. So the canonical works in English, you will have studied many of them at GCSE. Dickens and Shakespeare are considered canonical, as are Chaucer, Milton, the King James Bible. And there's also, I suppose, a 20th century canon, which involves some of the key modernist texts like James Joyce or Virginia Woolf, so on and so forth. The canon, I suppose, gets updated, and works don't get immediately put into the canon. There has to be some kind of critical consensus on which works belong in there, and I guess the test of time is one aspect. But we might consider that in the next few years, the dystopian genre or dystopian texts in future might be considered canonical within English. And it's worth thinking which texts in dystopian fiction would make the canon. Or if we were to construct a separate dystopian canon, as in a canon of dystopian literature, which text would be in there? It's an interesting evaluative exercise. The concept of canon itself is controversial and has become much more controversial in the latter part of the 20th century because the canon tends to be quite narrow. Writers tend to be almost universally middle-class males who are white, and I guess critical perspectives recently have looked at perhaps dismantling the canon or broadening the canon to include works in English from non-white writers or from a non-British perspective, the post-colonial perspective that brings in, I guess, works from writers of different cultures. The canon is, I guess, essentially quite a socially biased exercise. Who says one work is greater than another? It's a key critical question that we can ask. Well, if you want to consider which dystopian text would belong in the canon, there's a couple of links there that you can follow. Or you could also look up, Wikipedia has lists of the key dystopian fictions. You'll also find out there pop culture articles listing top 10 dystopias, giving you overviews of the text. They really range in their subjects and in their devices. And there's a dystopia out there for every taste. I won't discuss individual novels except perhaps where they're directly relevant to the way that we look at Handmaids. And I've already mentioned 1984 because that will be relevant to us. But we can think more broadly about all of those novels that belong in this dystopian genre, or which novels that might make a dystopian canon. What are those common themes that recur? Some have, I suppose, unique or fairly far-fetched premises, but there are some essential recurring themes. So what are those central premises in dystopian texts? Well, common themes certainly include totalitarian governments, surveillance society in 1984, technocracies and technological advances, so technocratic societies in which I guess the scientists have taken over, the experts have taken over, and they have determined what society should look like for the benefit of everyone. Theocracies, similarly, where I guess the religious have taken over, and they have their own fundamentalist view of what society should look like, and they impose that on everyone. Some of these, if you've read Handmaids, and you should have read Handmaids, will start to sound familiar to you now. We also have post-apocalyptic societies. The post-apocalyptic wasteland is a familiar setting for certain dystopias. Fertility crises. Handmaids is not unique in its portrayal of fertility crises. There's also The Children of Men by P.D. James, which is a highly recommended dystopia. Different kinds of social division, of class division, often mixed in with other aspects of these. That's certainly present in 1984. Environmental calamities, linked perhaps to post-apocalyptic societies. These are envisioned in many dystopias, and anarchical societies, or societies without leadership, which I guess is a polar opposite of a totalitarian government. So I suppose there is maybe it's for you to decide whether there are essential features to a given dystopia. There are certainly patterns of themes that run across many dystopias. And as you read different examples of dystopia, as you learn more about novels within the dystopian genre, you realise that many more or less fit this pattern, but often they have unique features, and some perhaps are quite quirky or unusual, and some are perhaps, there are some texts that belong within the dystopian literary tradition where sometimes it's difficult to tell whether they're a dystopia or not, and that can actually be part of the author's intentions to provoke readers to ask us what the nature of a dystopia is. Overall, we can certainly say that dystopian themes are highly flexible, and this is an adaptable genre that can always be expanded and that can always find new territory as we find new technological advances as society develops. Dystopias are soon to follow to help us imagine perhaps what could go wrong, to help us explore our fears about the way that society is changing. A good example of that would be environmental catastrophe. It's only, of course, been the second half of the 20th century where we've perhaps imagined that humans might one day destroy the Earth, and that's become a central theme to many dystopias from this era. Okay. If you studied at GCSE or even at Key Stage 3 different models of conflict, these can also form a very useful tool for evaluating dystopias and the way that they work. The model of conflict that I present you here is a really interesting one because it develops, the three columns develop through different ages. The classical, I guess, being a pre-modern era in which protagonists are set against nature or against antagonists or frequently against God. Modern texts, and I guess dystopias are essentially, it's essentially a modern genre, a genre that's flourished in the modern age, featuring individuals against society, certainly in these totalitarian imaginings, but also in a conflict within protagonists. And I guess something that the 20th century forced societies to face up to like never before was the idea that there is no God or there is no kind of moral justice to the universe, a central theme of conflict perhaps in modern literature. The postmodern conflicts there are also part of our text, certainly, in which a protagonist questions the nature of reality, or in which a protagonist faces off against advanced technologies. This model provides, I think, quite a useful framework for considering the different forms of conflict in dystopias. Certainly, I would say that almost all dystopias form a conflict between protagonists and society, and protagonists and themselves. Internal conflict, the central panel of that framework, I think, is a key feature of almost any modern or postmodern text. It's also worth noting, significantly and perhaps ironically, the language in this poster, which you'll notice presupposes a central male character. And that's significant because that's one of the things that Atwood, in constructing The Handmaid's Tale, is seeking to correct. Atwood's own work, The Handmaids, its significant contribution to the dystopian genre is that it is the most convincing or the most well-known feminist perspective, or female perspective, if you like, of what a dystopia would be like for women. And many dystopian texts up until that point perhaps did not, like this poster, they were androcentric, they were centered around male norms. So let's look specifically then at some of those specific political and social contexts for the Handmaids. And on this first slide, I'd like to characterise the political conflict behind the Handmaids in terms of feminism against what we can call the new right. You will know that during the 20th century, terrible things happened, but also there was a progression in rights for many groups that had been previously marginalised. And during the 60s and the 70s, there was a great time of positive change for women. And especially in America in the 1970s, there were a number of decisive political victories, and feminists really felt that they were getting somewhere. In particular, there was a key legal case that established a legal precedent for abortion in the United States. That case was known as Roe versus Wade. And this was a seismic change in American politics in that it gave abortion as a constitutional right. This remains a really controversial division, as we shall see in American society right up until the present day. In the 1980s, there was what we could describe as a backlash to the progressive social changes of the civil rights movement and of feminism in the 1970s. And it's a fairly broad way of characterising it, but we could describe this backlash as the new right. And this is a socially conservative movement that seeks to re-establish traditional and religious family values on American society. And these groups that still exist, the New Right is still a very prominent powerful movement within American politics, as are progressive movements like feminism. But the New Right is hostile to women's rights generally, or certainly has a very narrow or limited view of what women's rights are, based particularly on religious views of women's rights. These groups are deeply sceptical about environmental science and evolution. And these groups generally are opposed to all kinds of sexual freedom. So they tend to take a very dim view of, shall we say, non-traditional relationships. They could be accused of homophobia. The roots of this new right movement, particularly in the US, belong to Puritanism. And the Puritans were the original pilgrims who fled persecution in Europe and sought to establish the very first white societies, if you like, in the US. And it's from these Puritan groups, really, that the US society is established. The original pilgrims, these Puritans, they were deeply devout believers, and they attempted to establish a theocratic society, a society in which the rules and norms of society was established on a strict interpretation of the Bible. Now, of course, America has had immigration from global immigration over the last 150 years and has risen to be a great superpower. But I guess the ruling core of America still has within it some of this original puritanical zeal. And it's still a very powerful traditional movement within American politics. And this is the political conflict against which Atwood is writing Handmaids in the 1980s. You can see the picture of her there writing Handmaids in Berlin in 1984 on an old typewriter. She's writing against this backdrop in which she, as a supporter of women's rights, feels that many of the hard-fought freedoms that women sought to establish in the 1970s are put at risk by this new political movement, which is seeking, I guess, to undo progress like Roe versus Wade, to take back control over women's rights, and to put women, I guess, back in the home, back in their traditional roles. So the text, its relevance, as we'll see later, is still based on this political conflict. There are lots of contemporary articles that you might read. A good one would be to read the No Balm and Gilead New York Times article. That's online. It features an extended interview with Atwood. It was at the time of publication, and it's a good piece of political... it helps to frame the political context in which Atwood is writing. Second part of context, or some broader context that we might think about specifically to the 1980s, that I think will have influenced some of the ideas within the novel, or that you can perhaps question yourself as to how they influence particular events. One was the AIDS virus, which in the late 70s and 80s was a sexually transmitted virus that wasn't really well understood. And that spread initially through gay communities. And this caused a lot of hysteria, a lot of social hysteria. And those within the New Right were very quick to portray AIDS as a kind of a divine punishment. And they viewed it as God's way of having punished homosexuals. But AIDS very quickly, of course, also spread through heterosexual societies. Again, the New Right then viewed this as a punishment for promiscuous behaviour, i.e. for sexual freedom, which they're generally opposed to. But overall, the 1980s is a time of paranoia with regards to viruses and what could be done. And this, we might think, is reflected in the idea of biblical plagues, and the fact that there's precedence in the Bible for biblical punishments or divine punishments imposed upon societies for their sin. So that's something that certainly is provoking the New Right in their beliefs. We might see this as present in the Handmaids in the collapse of the birth rate, which is, I guess, a central premise of the novel. Also perhaps in the environmental catastrophe, the environmental disaster. Also, we have the backdrop, I suppose, that frames the backdrop of 1984, the Cold War, the two superpowers, the USSR and the USA, locked in this conflict, this seemingly endless conflict between the two superpowers. They have nuclear arsenals which are powerful enough to completely obliterate the earth, and they fight these brutal proxy wars over smaller nations such as Vietnam. And this isn't just a power struggle between two similar nations, it's also an ideological divide. Both of these national identities, both the free Western world and the communist world, both believe that they have ideologies that will lead to a utopia. And this idealistic, ideological political belief is something that's certainly present in Gilead. The idea that a certain doctrine can lead to a perfect society for everyone. So we have politicians in the 1980s who are preaching, they're selling their political idealism, but in both the USSR and in the USSA, there are populations that are becoming disillusioned as they start to see hypocrisy and corruption in both of these identities. And certainly following Vietnam, there's a great deal of social protest in the US, where the government is constantly caught lying to its people, and this facade, which of course was equally true or even more true in communist Russia, this relationship between the truth and reality, this hypocrisy and disillusionment starts to appear in both societies. And finally then we have the growing awareness of pollution, and this idea that either through our nuclear arsenals, which we're as a global race, which we are accumulating in the 1980s, or our ongoing pollution through the greenhouse gases and emissions, there's a feeling starting to come around in the 1980s that we have the potential to destroy the earth on which we live. Many of those political contexts are represented in Atwood, in the Handmaids. We might also think, or you should think, also about the literary contexts or literary critical perspectives in which we could view the Handmaids. These, I guess, are the key philosophical, scientific changes in ideology that affected the 20th century. These are ways of looking. Critical perspectives offer us these ways of looking at texts, and if you go on to study literature at university, you'll understand that people's ideological basis for looking at a text will influence the aspects of the text that they choose to interpret. Elsewhere, I have produced a video looking at these four, all of which can be relevantly applied to the Handmaid's Tale. That is the Marxist, i.e. the communist ideological perspective, Freudian or psychoanalytical perspectives interpreting the power of dreams or the power of the unconscious, feminist perspectives, which I suppose most obviously can be relevantly applied to the Handmaids, and postmodern perspectives in perhaps as in the later part of the 20th century, as thinkers came to reject the idea of a single kind of truth and looked at texts as a much more subjective experience. This is another highly relevant concept that can be applied to Handmaids. A good starting point would be to look at the lesson that I have made available online for these, but also the Wikipedia pages for these ideas will provide you with a good overview of the different ways that people have approached literature in the 20th century. What's Atwood's own position on dystopia? Because she has her own very clearly developed ideas about the function of dystopias and about the way that she chooses to write dystopias. So there's a couple of key ideas here: speculative fiction and ustopia. Atwood is not just the writer of The Handmaid's Tale. She's an author who's written in a variety of genres, acclaimed. She's also an acclaimed poet. She's also a political or a key cultural figure, as we'll see later. But she has written other dystopias as well, and I offer there the example of Oryx and Crake, which we'll comment on in a second. So in writing her dystopias, Atwood rejects the label of science fiction and draws, I guess, a distinction between science fiction and what she calls speculative fiction. And she explains that in the quote there. And the quote explains how Atwood seeks her speculative fictions or her dystopias to imagine a possible future, a future for which we already have the technology, a future which may not be immediate now, but is possible based on the technologies that we've got. She uses as a contrast the science fiction genre in which we are able to do the impossible. So I suppose by proposing this idea of speculative fiction, she's keeping her writing based on the possible and based more closely on the technologies that exist within our society, and being perhaps more believable and therefore being perhaps more fearful. So a key distinction is understanding the difference between what Atwood calls science fiction and what she calls her own work, speculative fiction. She also, not rejects the term dystopia and utopia, but she's synthesized them. She's created this hybrid, something that she calls ustopia. And you can see ustopia kind of combines, synthesizes, if you like, the two words. And in her quote, she says that dystopia and utopia contain versions of the other. And the point that she's making here really is that whether any given society is a dystopia or a utopia is a question of your perspective. And that's certainly something that many people in the 20th century would have agreed with or acknowledged. The communist society in Russia became really a dystopian nightmare for many people, but certainly for some of the ruling elites, it was probably quite utopian. They were probably quite happy. So if dystopia and utopia is a question of perspective, then this idea of ustopia perhaps shows us that there are that one person's dystopia is another's utopia. And the commander himself, this is alluded to very strongly in Handmaids, this idea, where the commander says that better never means better for everyone. It always means worse for some. And we might suggest that if you were to rewrite the Handmaid's Tale as the commander's tale and rewrite it from his perspective, it might actually be a utopian novel and not a dystopian novel. And as we go on in the next lesson to look at narrative perspective, perhaps we can explore how Offred's individual perspective is key to presenting Gilead as a dystopia, whereas other perspectives might see it in different ways. Some wider reading suggestions. Oryx and Crake, which is another one of Atwood's dystopias, is certainly worth reading. It asks the question, what if genetic science were used to create new species? Where would that leave us? It is another powerful dystopia that is speculative fiction in as much as it's based on technologies which we already possess. You also might think about this ustopia and the idea that dystopias may appear utopian depending on your perspective. Huxley's Brave New World is one such, where the dystopia, I suppose, is in many senses a perfect society, and its flaws are quite subtle. Another example is The Giver, which was written by Lois, I can't remember her surname, but The Giver is a good dystopia to look up. Another dystopia that really, from other perspectives, seems actually quite ideal, quite utopian. Here I've collected some quotes from Atwood based on the Handmaids herself. It's a good little a summary of quotes here for some of the ideas that helped to inspire her to write. She is very candid about her own writing process for the Handmaids. She interviews regularly. There are many published interviews with her out there where people have questioned her reasons for writing Handmaids, and a little bit of simple internet research will provide you with your own really good results. Many of these quotes would provide a powerful tool for evaluating and would also credit you very highly for your understanding of context. Particularly ideas there such as this idea that she has a rule where she doesn't include anything in her speculative fictions that humans haven't already done And that she says that there's nothing in Handmaids that hasn't already happened at some point in time. And I guess that's part of what makes it even more fearful. There's also a quote there, a larger quote at the bottom, which offers her perspective on Puritanism and her historical perspective, if you like, of the Puritans. She views the original Puritan attempt to create a perfect society in the US as an attempt to establish a regime where they could persecute people who didn't follow their strict puritanical beliefs. And that's certainly in the religious justifications for Gilead. There's an implicit criticism there of what might be called puritanical approaches to religion. Certainly pause the video at this point and note down some of those key quotes, but also you would be advised to think about the way that those key quotes could be applied to specific instances from the novel. Finally then, what about the contemporary relevance of this novel? It's a novel that seems to grow in relevance year on year, and that's something about dystopias and why the best dystopias become part of a kind of a popular or social consciousness in such a strong way. 1984 is a great example. At the time of writing 1984, Orwell couldn't really have predicted things like Facebook and Amazon and these mass data surveillance societies. He also couldn't have predicted our kind of post-truth media in which the truth is something that can really be argued over or bought. But lo and behold, we have those features in our society, and they make 1984 seem even more resonant, even more relevant. And the same is true of The Handmaid's Tale. Why? Well, that conflict between progressive and traditional values in both American and global society is continuing to rage. And Atwood has very much become a figurehead for the progressive values of feminism and for women's rights. You'll see there she featuring on the cover of Time magazine, described as the reluctant prophet. Many people feel that she's accurately predicting in The Handmaids the direction of society, and that's reflected there in some of the images that you see. Handmaids' uniforms become to symbolise the protest for women's rights, and you see the placard that someone is holding there is "This is how it starts." Meanwhile, the new right continues to exercise its power over American politics, especially in the South, where recently we've seen abortion laws. There's been a threat to repeal or to fight back against rulings like Roe and Roe versus Wade, and to, I suppose, offer a more religious perspective on abortion. So movements like Me Too, spelt incorrectly on this PowerPoint, but nevertheless a fact of our society. These are a response against this kind of sexual exploitation as well, which has become, I suppose, emblematic of a certain kind of powerful structure and hypocrisy of perhaps rich, powerful men who espouse conservative Christian ideals, but perhaps in private are guilty of sexual exploitation of women. This is the battle that rages on. So we ask this question, Handmaids, it can't really happen here, can it? But often when we read the novel, we see things which perhaps chime with things that we are witnessing in our own society, which force us to ask the question, maybe it could. Here's a summary of the things that we've looked at in this lesson. We covered the question, we looked at the value of wider reading, we've explored some key dystopian ideas, the historical and social context of Handmaids, and we've also looked at Atwood's own perspective on Handmaids and its current relevance. In the next lesson, we will be exploring the narrative of Handmaids, how the narrative is positioned and how the narrative is structured. In later lessons, we'll go on and look at analysing language in detail and extract analysis. And finally, we will look at pointers for approaching the question. Thank you very much for your attention and your focus. I hope that you found this valuable content useful. Please subscribe so that you are notified of future videos. Leave me a comment, put a like up, to help motivate me to make more of these videos if you find the content worthwhile. And good luck with your studies.